Real nightmares.
The rusty iron gates creaked open, groaning like a dying animal, as Claire pushed against the cold metal. She stared up at the abandoned orphanage, its looming facade partially hidden by the thick, creeping fog that seemed to emanate from the very ground. The building stood like a skeletal sentinel, its broken windows resembling hollow eyes that watched them approach. Claire shivered, not from the chill in the air, but from the unsettling sense of dread that gripped her heart. She wasn't alone. 5 other volunteers accompanied her, each armed with gloves, garbage bags, and a vague sense of goodwill. "Let's get this over with," muttered Eddie, an ex-cop whose face bore the hard lines of someone who had seen too much. He was eager to start, and even more eager to leave. The others mumbled in agreement, but Claire remained silent, her eyes still fixed on the towering structure before them. The orphanage had been closed for decades, abandoned after a scandal involving the deaths of several children under mysterious circumstances. Over the years, it had become the subject of ghost stories and urban legends, a place where locals dared each other to spend a night. But for Claire, it was just another project to fill the emptiness that had settled in her life. After losing her own child, the pain of the empty nursery at home had become unbearable. She needed a distraction, and helping clean up this old orphanage before its demolition seemed like the perfect, if slightly morbid, task. As they stepped inside, the air grew colder. The floorboards creaked beneath their feet, and the smell of mildew and rot filled their nostrils. Dust floated in the air, catching the weak beams of sunlight that filtered through the broken windows. Old furniture lay strewn about, draped with tattered sheets, as if someone had attempted to hide the shame of neglect. Faded children's toys lay scattered on the floor, remnants of forgotten lives. Mara, a young nurse with a soft, empathetic face, broke the uneasy silence. "I don't like this place. It feels wrong." Her voice trembled, and she crossed her arms over her chest, as if trying to ward off a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Tom, the oldest of the group, nodded slowly. His hand shook as he adjusted his glasses, his face pale under the dim light. "I was here once, a long time ago," he muttered, "before they closed it down. I can still remember the cries, the way they echoed through these halls." "Enough with the ghost stories," Eddie snapped, his voice harsh. "Let's just get to work." He turned and headed down a hallway, his footsteps echoing in the silence. Claire watched him go, then glanced at Mara, who seemed frozen in place. "Come on," she said gently, placing a hand on the younger woman's shoulder. "The sooner we start, the sooner we can leave." They moved deeper into the orphanage, their footsteps crunching over broken glass and debris. Each room they entered was a snapshot of despair, rusted bed frames, peeling wallpaper, and strange stains on the floors. In the main hall, Claire spotted something that made her stop in her tracks. There, on the far wall, was a faded mural of children playing. Their faces were barely visible beneath the layers of grime and age, but what little remained of their expressions seemed twisted, distorted, as if caught in silent screams. A chill ran down Claire's spine, and she quickly turned away, trying to shake off the unease that clung to her. She noticed a narrow staircase leading to the upper floors. "I'll check upstairs," she announced, more to herself than to anyone else. She needed to distance herself from the group, if only for a moment. Her chest felt tight, and the familiar weight of grief was pressing down on her again. As she ascended the creaking stairs, each step seemed to echo louder than the last. Reaching the landing, she pushed open a door to a small room. It was dark, with only a single broken window allowing a sliver of gray light to slip through. In the corner, she saw a small, worn-out crib covered in dust. She felt her breath hitch. A memory flashed. Her own nursery, silent and empty. The crib untouched since that terrible day. Suddenly, she heard it. The faint sound of children laughing, distant yet close, echoing off the walls. Claire's heart raced. She glanced around, but the room was empty. She took a step back, nearly tripping over a broken chair. The laughter stopped as abruptly as it had started, leaving only the heavy silence in its wake. "Just your imagination," she whispered to herself, trying to steady her breathing. But deep down, she felt something stir, a sense that maybe, just maybe, the stories were true, and the forgotten children were not as forgotten as everyone believed. Claire descended the stairs slowly, her mind still echoing with the ghostly laughter she'd heard in the empty room. She tried to shake it off as a trick of her imagination, but the sensation lingered like a shadow, clinging to her. She rejoined the group in the main hall, where the atmosphere was heavy with dust and unease. The volunteers had started their work, bagging up debris and trying to clear out the remnants of a life that had long since withered away. Eddie was grumbling as he dragged a broken chair across the floor, his frustration palpable. "This place is a dump," he muttered, tossing the chair into a pile of discarded furniture. "I don't see why anyone would want to clean it up. Just tear it down already." Tom, meanwhile, seemed distracted. He stood by a boarded-up door, his eyes distant as if he were looking at something far away. "This door wasn't always here," he said quietly. "I remember there was a different entrance to a different place." Mara glanced at him with concern. "What do you mean, Tom?" she asked gently. "A different place?" Tom shook his head, as if shaking off a bad dream. "I don't know," he mumbled. "It's just, it feels different, like something's missing." Claire, still uneasy from her experience upstairs, decided to explore further. She noticed a narrow hallway leading off from the main entrance, partially blocked by a heavy cabinet. "Help me move this," she called to Eddie, who reluctantly joined her. Together, they pushed the cabinet aside, revealing a door that looked as if it hadn't been opened in decades. "Looks like we found the caretaker's office," Eddie said, shining a flashlight through the grime-covered glass panel. "Or what's left of it, anyway." Claire pushed open the door, and they stepped inside. The room was small, cluttered with old papers, broken furniture, and a thick layer of dust that hung in the air like a shroud. Claire's eyes were drawn to a large wooden desk in the center. On it lay an open ledger, its yellowed pages filled with names written in spidery handwriting. Beside it, a stack of drawings caught her attention. She picked one up and held it to the dim light. Her breath caught in her throat. The drawing showed a group of children standing in a line, their faces pale and empty. Above them loomed a tall, shadowy figure with eyes like hollow pits, its hands reaching out as if to pull the children into the darkness. Claire felt a chill creep down her spine as she flipped to the next drawing. This one was even more disturbing. A child, alone in a corner, with wide, terrified eyes staring out at something unseen. Over and over, the same motif repeated. Children, alone or in groups, always under the oppressive shadow of some malevolent presence. Mara and Tom entered the room, drawn by the silence. "What did you find?" Mara asked softly, her voice barely a whisper as she took in the eerie drawings. "Just drawings," Claire said, her voice trembling. "But they're not right. Look at this one." She held up another drawing, this one depicting a small, dark room filled with beds and shadowy figures hovering over each one. The beds were arranged in a grid, like a dormitory, but the figures were indistinct, more like smudges than people. Tom's face went white. "That's the West Wing," he said, his voice barely audible. "The boys' dormitory. I remember it, but it wasn't like that." The room grew colder, the air heavy with an unnatural chill. Suddenly, the door to the office slammed shut with a deafening bang, and the light flickered. Claire dropped the drawing, her heart racing. The room seemed to close in around them, and for a moment, she thought she heard that same distant laughter again, this time accompanied by faint whispers. "We need to leave," Eddie said, his voice tense. "Now," but Claire shook her head. Her eyes locked on a particular drawing at the bottom of the pile. It showed a single crib, empty and dark, with small handprints pressed against the bars. Her heart thudded painfully as she realized it looked almost identical to the crib she'd seen upstairs. "There's something we're missing," she said, more to herself than to the others. "Something they're trying to show us." Mara bent down to pick up another drawing. "Maybe they want us to understand what happened to them," she suggested, "to remember them. Or maybe they want us to suffer like they did." Eddie retorted. Whatever it is, I'm not sticking around to find out. Tom remained silent, his gaze fixed on the door that had slammed shut. It's not that simple, he murmured. If we leave now, we might not make it out. Not all of us. As they debated their next move, the temperature dropped further, and the oppressive weight of unseen eyes bore down on them. The drawings scattered around the floor seemed to tremble, almost as if they were alive, as if they were trying to reach out to the living. Claire knew they had stepped into something far more sinister than any of them had anticipated, a place where the past refused to die. The orphanage, it seemed, had secrets it wasn't ready to let go of, and those secrets were clawing their way back into the present. The tension in the room was almost palpable. The volunteers stood huddled together, eyes darting nervously between the closed door and the disturbing drawings scattered across the floor. The air was heavy, and every breath felt like inhaling ice. Claire's gaze remained fixed on the drawing of the crib, her mind racing with questions she couldn't quite put into words. She could feel something stirring, a presence, an intent, watching them from the shadows. Let's keep moving, Claire said, breaking the silence. We need to figure out what happened here. Maybe there are more clues in the other rooms. Reluctantly, the group agreed. They filed out of the caretaker's office, stepping back into the dimly lit hallway. The floorboards creaked beneath their feet, groaning under the weight of history and secrets. Tom suggested they split up to cover more ground, his voice tight with tension. Stay in pairs, he said. We don't know what we're dealing with yet. Claire and Mara headed toward the west wing, the part of the orphanage where the boys' dormitory had once been. Eddie and Tom moved in the opposite direction, toward what used to be the classrooms. As Claire and Mara made their way through the narrow corridors, the sense of being watched only intensified. Faint whispers seemed to follow them, always just out of earshot, like a breeze carrying distant voices. Did you hear that? Mara whispered, her hand clutching Claire's arm. It sounded like someone crying. Claire listened closely. At first, all she could hear was the pounding of her own heartbeat. But then she heard it, a soft, muffled sobbing coming from down the hall. She felt a chill run down her spine, but she pressed on, Mara sticking close by her side. The sobbing grew louder, more distinct, until they reached a door that hung slightly ajar. Claire pushed it open. Inside, the room was dark except for a small, dirty window that let in a weak beam of light. In the corner, a figure hunched over, shoulders shaking with the force of its sobs. It looked like a child no older than 7 or 8, dressed in old-fashioned, tattered clothes. Claire's breath caught in her throat. "Hello," she called softly, taking a cautious step forward. The figure stopped crying and turned slowly to face them. Mara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The child's face was pale, almost translucent, with hollow eyes that seemed to look right through them. There was a moment of stillness, a suspended breath in time. Then, without warning, the child opened its mouth and let out a blood-curdling scream, a sound filled with terror and pain, echoing off the walls like a siren. Claire stumbled back, her hands covering her ears, but the scream kept coming, a deafening wail that seemed to vibrate in her bones. Mara grabbed her arm, pulling her away. "Run!" she shouted, and they bolted from the room, slamming the door behind them. The screaming stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence that was somehow worse. They didn't stop running until they reached the main hall, where they found Eddie and Tom waiting, both looking pale and shaken. "What happened?" Eddie demanded. We heard something." "A child," Claire panted, still catching her breath. Or something that looked like a child. It screamed at us." Tom nodded, his face grim. "We heard it too, but from a different direction. This place is playing tricks on us." Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the hall, and the group turned to see one of the volunteers, Mark, who had been with them earlier, standing at the end of the corridor. His face was pale, and his eyes wide with terror. "I saw them," he whispered, his voice trembling. "The children, they're everywhere." Before anyone could react, Mark collapsed to his knees, clutching his head, His body began to convulse violently, and his eyes rolled back into his head. Claire rushed over to him, but as she reached out, he looked up with a vacant stare. "They want us to stay," he muttered, his voice suddenly calm, almost mechanical. "They want us to be like them." Then, as quickly as it started, the convulsion stopped. Mark fell limp, his eyes closing, his body still. Mara checked his pulse and shook her head. "He's gone," she whispered, her voice hollow. A cold dread settled over the group as they realized that whatever was in this orphanage was not just toying with them. It was hunting them. Eddie, his face pale and sweating, backed away from Mark's body. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. Now, Tom looked at Claire, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "We can't leave yet," he said firmly. "There's something keeping us here, and I don't think it's going to let us go until we understand what it is. Or until it gets what it wants," Claire replied, her voice heavy with dread. The orphanage seemed to breathe around them, its darkened hallways filled with whispers and shadows. They were no longer just intruders in a haunted house. They were prey in a maze with no clear way out, and the forgotten children were closing in. The group's resolve was beginning to fray, their nerves worn thin by the constant sense of dread pressing down on them. The oppressive atmosphere of the orphanage seemed to twist around them like a living thing, its corridors growing darker and more confining with every step. The whispers were louder now, carrying with them a mix of laughter, cries, and something else, a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the walls. Claire and Tom exchanged a grim look. "We need to keep moving," Tom said, his voice steady but tense. "We have to find out what's keeping us here. Maybe there's something in the basement, the place where they used to punish the children." Eddie's eyes widened. "Punish? What do you mean, punish?" Tom took a deep breath, clearly reluctant to say more. Back in the day, there were stories about how the caretakers used to deal with the more troublesome children, locking them up in the dark, sometimes for days. Some never came back up. Mara shivered, her hand gripping Claire's arm tighter. "That's horrible, and we're just going to go down there." Claire nodded, feeling a steely resolve settle over her. "If there's any place that holds the answers, it's there. We can't leave until we know what we're up against." With heavy hearts, they headed toward the entrance to the basement, a narrow staircase descending into darkness at the end of the main hall. The further they went, the colder the air became, and the walls seemed to close in around them. The stairs creaked under their weight, each step echoing in the silence, until they reached the bottom. The darkness was almost impenetrable, the dim beam of their flashlights barely cutting through the thick, soupy blackness. Eddie, who was at the back of the group, muttered under his breath. "I hate this place," he said, his voice trembling. "It's like it's alive." They moved deeper into the basement, their footsteps crunching over old debris and God knows what else. The smell of damp earth and decay was overpowering. The room opened up into a large, low-ceilinged space, filled with old, rusted metal cages and wooden restraints that sent a shiver down Claire's spine. The walls were covered in scratches, deep, desperate gouges that looked like they had been made by human hands. "Dear God," Mara whispered, her eyes wide as she looked around. "What kind of place was this?" Tom was quiet, his face pale as he stared at the cages. "A place of suffering," he finally said, "and it hasn't forgotten." Suddenly, a noise cut through the silence, a soft, rhythmic tapping coming from the far end of the basement. It was slow and deliberate, like someone knocking against a wall in a steady, maddening rhythm. Claire raised her flashlight and saw a small figure standing at the edge of the light. It was a child, a young girl, her face hidden in shadow. She was tapping a small stone against the wall, again and again, in a trance-like state. Claire took a cautious step forward. "Hello," she called out. Are you okay?" The girl stopped tapping. Slowly, she turned her head to face them, revealing a face that was both young and ancient, her eyes hollow and black. Claire's heart thudded in her chest. The girl smiled, a slow, unnatural curl of her lips that sent a wave of terror through Claire's body. "Why don't you stay and play?" the girl whispered, her voice raspy and echoing unnaturally in the dark space. "They like it when you stay." Before anyone could react, the girl lunged forward with a speed that defied reality, her form distorting as if the shadows themselves were moving with her. Claire barely had time to react as the girl's hand shot out, ice-cold fingers grazing her skin. She stumbled back, and Mara screamed, pulling Claire away just in time. "Run!" Tom shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. They sprinted back through the basement, their flashlights bouncing wildly off the walls. The air seemed to thicken around them, pulling at their limbs as if the orphanage itself was trying to slow them down. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, as if dozens of voices were calling out to them from every corner, begging, crying, laughing. They reached the stairs, but Eddie wasn't with them. Claire turned around, her eyes frantically searching the darkness. "Eddie!" she shouted. "Where are you?" Tom grabbed her arm. "We can't stay. We have to go." But Claire pulled away, shining her flashlight back down the corridor. She saw him then, standing at the far end, his back to them, staring into the darkness. "Eddie!" she called again. "Come on." He didn't move. She could see his shoulders trembling, his body swaying slightly, as if in a trance. Then she heard it, a soft, childlike voice whispering in the darkness, just beyond the reach of their lights. "Stay with us, Eddie. Stay and play." Eddie turned slowly, his face blank, his eyes wide and unseeing. I think I should stay," he murmured. "They need me here." Without thinking, Claire rushed forward, grabbing his arm and pulling him back. "No, Eddie, we're getting out of here." As she tugged him back toward the stairs, the voices grew louder, almost a scream, filled with rage and sorrow. The temperature plummeted, and the walls seemed to shake as if the building itself was in pain. With one final effort, Claire and Tom dragged Eddie up the stairs, back into the main hall, slamming the door behind them. Eddie collapsed against the wall, gasping for breath, his eyes wild and panicked. I don't know what happened," he stammered. I couldn't stop listening to them." Mara knelt beside him, trying to calm him down, but Claire knew that whatever had reached out to Eddie wasn't done with them yet. They had stirred something ancient and angry, something that had been waiting in the darkness for far too long. "We have to find a way to end this," Claire said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "Before it ends us." The group nodded, their fear now mixed with a grim determination. They were in too deep to turn back. Whatever haunted this orphanage had decided that they were not leaving alive. The orphanage seemed to pulsate with a life of its own, the walls breathing and shifting like the ribs of a great, slumbering beast. Claire felt it in her bones, a deep, rhythmic thrum that resonated with every beat of her heart. She knew they had to keep moving, to find the root of whatever malevolent force had gripped this place. But where to look? The basement had given them only a taste of the horrors that lay hidden in these walls. They needed more, a key to unravel the truth. Tom's eyes were fixed on the large, rotting portrait that hung above the main staircase. It depicted a stern-looking woman, her eyes cold and devoid of compassion. "That's Sister Agnes," he muttered, almost to himself. "She ran this place with an iron fist. There were rumors, stories about how she would deal with the children who misbehaved." Claire followed his gaze, studying the woman's harsh features. "You think she's behind this, or whatever's left of her?" Tom nodded. "Maybe. Or maybe she's just part of it, a fragment of the evil that's seeped into this place over the years. Either way, we need to find out more about her. Maybe there's something in her office." Mara and Eddie exchanged uneasy glances but nodded. They had seen enough to know that leaving now wasn't an option. Not until they understood what was holding them here, what had already claimed one of their own. They made their way up the grand staircase, their footsteps echoing in the empty halls. The orphanage seemed to sense their intent, the whispers growing softer, more distant, as if retreating just out of reach. Claire couldn't tell if it was a good sign or a bad one. She glanced back at Eddie, who was still visibly shaken, his hands trembling as he gripped the banister. "Stay close," she whispered, her eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. They reached the top of the stairs, and Tom led them to a large wooden door at the end of the corridor. It was partially ajar, and a plaque on the door read, "Sister Agnes, Headmistress." Tom pushed it open, revealing a spacious office filled with old furniture and religious artifacts. The air was thick with the smell of mold and decay. Inside, the room was dominated by a massive oak desk, its surface cluttered with dusty papers and old, faded photographs. A large crucifix hung on the wall behind the desk, its wooden Christ figure staring down at them with an almost accusatory glare. Mara started going through the papers, her hands shaking slightly. "These are all letters," she said, her voice hushed. "Complaints from parents, reports from staff. And look at this." She pulled out a yellow document, the ink faded but still legible. "It's a report on the children who disappeared." Claire took the paper, her eyes scanning the words. "Punishment, isolation, special care." It sounds like they were hiding something, or someone. Tom was rifling through the desk drawers when he pulled out a small, leather-bound journal. He flipped it open, his eyes widening as he read. "It's Sister Agnes' diary," he said. "Listen to this. The children have been acting strangely. They speak of shadows that whisper and rooms that are not rooms. I've told them it's nonsense, that they must pray harder. But I hear them too, the voices in the walls." Claire felt a chill run through her. She knew something was wrong here, even back then. Eddie, who had been silent until now, pointed to a bookshelf on the far wall. "What's that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He walked over and ran his hand along the edge of the shelf, feeling a slight draft. "There's something behind here." The group worked together, pushing the heavy shelf away from the wall to reveal a hidden door, its wood old and cracked with age. Tom gave Claire a nervous glance before reaching for the handle. "Ready?" he asked. She nodded, and he pulled the door open. A cold gust of air blew past them, and they were greeted by a narrow, spiraling staircase descending into darkness. "This must be where they took the children who were never seen again," Mara whispered, her face pale. "The ones who went missing." Claire felt a knot form in her stomach. "We have to go down there," she said, her voice resolute. "If there's any place that holds the answers, it's there." One by one, they descended the creaking staircase, their flashlights cutting through the thick darkness. The steps seemed to go on forever, spiraling deeper and deeper into the bowels of the orphanage. Claire could feel the air growing colder with each step, and the whispers returned, softer now, almost like a lullaby. Finally, they reached the bottom, stepping into a small, stone chamber lit by the flickering flame of a single candle. In the center of the room was a large, circular stone slab, covered in dark stains that looked disturbingly like old blood. Chains hung from the walls, and the floor was littered with small, white objects, bones. Mara let out a small gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. "Oh my God," she whispered. "They brought them down here for this." Tom moved closer to the stone slab, his face a mix of horror and fascination. "This is where they did it, where they tried to cleanse them." Suddenly, the whispers grew louder, a cacophony of desperate, pleading voices filling the chamber. Claire felt a sharp, stabbing pain in her head, as if the voices were trying to drill their way into her mind. She fell to her knees, clutching her temples, and the others did the same. "Leave!" a voice hissed louder than the rest. "Leave this place or suffer the same fate." Through the pain, Claire forced herself to speak. "What do you want from us?" she shouted. "What do you need?" The voices quieted for a moment. Then one voice, a child's voice, spoke clearly. "Release us," it said. "Free us from the darkness." Claire's heart pounded in her chest as she realized what they had to do. "We need to destroy this place," she said, her voice shaky but determined. "Burn it to the ground. It's the only way to set them free." Tom nodded, his face grim. Then that's what we'll do. They had found their answer, but now they had to survive long enough to carry it out, and the orphanage wasn't going to let them go without a fight. The plan was simple, but the execution was anything but. The group stumbled back up the narrow staircase, hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. The voices seemed to grow angrier, the whispers becoming shrieks that echoed off the walls, making it feel like the orphanage was alive with rage. Claire led the way, her mind racing with the realization of what needed to be done. "We need to find anything that can burn," she said, her voice strained but determined. "Wood, paper, anything. And we need to get it to the main hall." Tom nodded, his face set in grim determination. "I saw some old furniture in the classrooms. We can break it up, use it to start a fire." Mara looked terrified, her eyes darting around the dim hallway as if expecting something to leap out of the shadows. "Are you sure this will work?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. What if it just makes things worse?" Claire met her gaze, trying to project confidence she didn't quite feel. "It's the only chance we have," she replied. "We either burn this place down or we die here." Eddie, still visibly shaken from his encounter in the basement, nodded in agreement. "I'm with you," he said. "Let's just get this over with." They split up, moving quickly through the orphanage's winding hallways, gathering anything that could help fuel the fire. Chairs, broken desks, old curtains, anything that would burn. The building seemed to groan in protest with every step they took, the walls creaking and shifting as if trying to contain them. The whispers became more distinct, forming into disembodied voices that cried out in a chorus of anger and despair. "You cannot leave," they chanted. "You cannot leave us." Claire and Mara hauled a stack of wooden chairs into the main hall, dumping them in a pile near the center of the room. Eddie and Tom followed, dragging what looked like a broken bench and a heap of tattered books. The air was thick with tension, and every creak and groan of the building felt like a warning. Tom pulled out a small metal lighter, his hands trembling slightly as he flicked it open. "Once we light this," he said, "we need to move fast. The fire's going to spread quickly, and we don't want to get trapped in here." Claire nodded, glancing around at the others. "Stay close together. No one goes off on their own. We head straight for the front door, and we don't stop for anything." They all nodded in agreement. Tom bent down, holding the flame to the pile of wood and fabric. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a soft whoosh, the fire caught, flames licking up the side of the pile and spreading quickly. The dry wood crackled and popped as the fire grew, spreading across the makeshift pyre. The orphanage seemed to react instantly. A low, guttural growl reverberated through the walls, followed by a sudden, deafening wail that filled the air, like the howl of a wounded animal. The whispers turned to screams, a cacophony of children's voices crying out in pain and fury. "Go, go, go!" Claire shouted, grabbing Mara's hand and pulling her toward the front entrance. The heat from the flames was already becoming unbearable, and thick smoke began to fill the air, stinging their eyes and burning their lungs. Tom and Eddie were right behind them, coughing as they stumbled through the growing haze. They reached the front door and pulled at the heavy wood, but it wouldn't budge. "It's stuck!" Mara screamed, panic rising in her voice. "We're trapped!" Tom slammed his shoulder against the door, but it didn't move. "It's like something's holding it shut." The fire was spreading faster than they'd anticipated, crawling up the walls and licking at the ceiling. The temperature soared, and the air became thick with acrid smoke. Claire could barely see through the haze, her vision blurring as the heat pressed in around them. "We need to find another way out," Claire shouted, her voice barely audible over the roar of the flames and the screaming voices. They turned back, searching desperately for an escape. The hallway to the side seemed less engulfed by flames, and they sprinted toward it, hoping to find a window or another exit. But as they ran, the orphanage began to change. The walls seemed to stretch and shift, twisting into unnatural angles, turning what should have been a straight corridor into a confusing maze. "Where are we?" Eddie gasped, his voice choked with smoke and panic. This isn't where we came from. Claire realized with growing horror that the orphanage was twisting itself around them, warping reality to trap them inside. The walls seemed to move closer, and the floor buckled beneath their feet. "It's not going to let us leave," she said, her voice hoarse and trembling. "It wants to keep us here like the others." "Like hell it will," Tom yelled, slamming his fist against the wall in frustration. "There has to be a way out." Suddenly, Mara screamed, pointing down the hall. "Look!" A figure was emerging from the smoke, a small child, her face pale and eyes hollow. Behind her, more figures appeared, a sea of ghostly children staring at them with empty, accusing eyes. "You can't leave," the girl whispered, her voice cutting through the chaos like a knife. "Stay with us. Forever." Claire's mind raced. She remembered the diary, Sister Agnes, words about the darkness in the walls. "It's the orphanage," she said, the realization hitting her like a cold splash of water. "It's feeding on the children's spirits. That's what's keeping it alive." Tom looked at her, eyes wide with understanding. "So how do we stop it?" "We need to break the cycle," Claire replied. "We have to release them." "But how?" The fire was spreading faster now, closing in from all sides. The children were advancing, their forms flickering like static in the smoke-filled air. Claire felt a sudden surge of desperation. She stepped forward, toward the ghostly girl, ignoring the flames and the heat. "You don't have to stay here anymore," Claire said, her voice firm but gentle. "You don't have to be afraid. We're going to help you. But you have to let us go." The girl's hollow eyes seemed to bore into Claire's soul, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, slowly, the girl nodded, her form flickering and fading like a dying ember. One by one, the other children followed, their figures dissolving into the smoke. Suddenly, the walls stopped moving. The oppressive force holding them in place seemed to lift. Tom ran to a nearby window, smashing it open with a chair. "This way!" he shouted. They scrambled through the window, one by one, tumbling out into the cold night air, just as the flames erupted through the roof of the orphanage. They stumbled away from the building, coughing and gasping for breath, as the entire structure was consumed by the inferno. The screams inside the orphanage faded, replaced by a deafening silence. Claire watched as the flames roared higher, feeling a strange mixture of sorrow and relief. The spirits were gone, released, at last, from the place that had trapped them for so long. They had survived, but the memories of the orphanage and the horrors they had witnessed within its walls would stay with them forever. The fire had raged through the night, turning the old orphanage into little more than a smoldering ruin. By the time the sun rose, only the charred skeleton of the building remained, a dark silhouette against the morning sky. The townspeople had gathered at a distance, drawn by the smoke and the blaze, but no one dared to approach until the flames had died down to embers. Claire, Tom, Mara, and Eddie sat on the edge of a nearby hill, their faces streaked with soot and exhaustion. They watched in silence as the last of the fire was extinguished, leaving behind only ashes. The air was cold, a stark contrast to the searing heat of the inferno that had nearly claimed their lives. None of them spoke for a long time, each lost in their own thoughts, replaying the night's horrors in their minds. Claire finally broke the silence, her voice rough and weary. "Do you think it's over?" she asked, her eyes still fixed on the charred remains of the orphanage. Tom nodded slowly, though his face was grim. "It has to be," he said. "The spirits, the children, they're free now. We saw them leave. Whatever was holding them there, it's gone." Mara hugged her knees to her chest, her eyes hollow and distant. "But we'll never forget," she murmured. "What we saw, what we felt. I don't think I'll ever be able to close my eyes without seeing their faces." Eddie, who had been quiet for most of the morning, finally spoke up. His voice was shaky, but there was a determined edge to it. "Maybe that's the point," he said. "Maybe we're not supposed to forget. We survived, but not everyone did. And those kids, they were trapped there for so long. We have to remember, so nothing like this ever happens again." They all fell silent again, the weight of Eddie's words settling over them like a heavy fog. Claire knew he was right. What they'd experienced was something that would stay with them forever, etched into their minds like a scar that would never fully heal. But maybe that was okay. Maybe some scars were meant to be carried, to remind them of the darkness they'd faced and the light they'd managed to find within it. As the hours passed, the crowd of townspeople began to disperse, muttering among themselves, unsure of what had truly happened here. Some spoke of ghosts and curses, while others dismissed it as just an old building gone up in flames. But Claire knew the truth, and so did her friends. They had confronted something ancient and evil, something that fed on fear and despair, and they had survived. A police car eventually pulled up, and an officer approached them, his face a mixture of concern and confusion. "You folks okay?" he asked. "What happened here?" Tom glanced at the others before replying. "The orphanage caught fire," he said simply. "We were just passing by." The officer frowned, clearly skeptical, but he didn't press the issue. "Well, you're lucky to be alive," he said. "Best head back into town. Get yourselves checked out. And if you remember anything else, let us know." Claire nodded, and the officer walked away, still shaking his head. She looked at her friends, feeling a strange sense of unity with them, a bond forged in the crucible of terror and survival. "Come on," she said, standing up. "Let's get out of here." They started down the hill, moving slowly, each step heavy with the weight of what they'd been through. As they walked, Claire glanced back one last time at the ruins of the orphanage. The smoke still rose and thin, ghostly tendrils, reaching up toward the sky, as if trying to escape the earth. "Rest in peace," she whispered softly. "You're free now." And with that, she turned away, heading back toward the town. And whatever came next, the future was uncertain. But one thing was clear. They would never be the same. And perhaps, in some way, that was a good thing. They had faced the darkness and emerged into the light, scarred but stronger, bound together by the haunting memory of the place that had tried to claim them.